It's October 27th, 1962. 300 feet under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine is dying. Not from an attack, from the air inside it running out. The temperature inside the ship has climbed past 45 degrees Celsius, hotter than a sauna. Carbon dioxide levels are rising. Some of the crew have already passed out. They've had no contact with Moscow for days. No news, no orders. And right now, above them, American warships are dropping explosives into the water, not to sink them, but to force them to the surface. The Soviet crew doesn't know that. All they know is this: bombs are falling around their submarine, and for all they know, World War III has already started. There are 3 senior officers on this submarine, and there is one weapon on board that almost nobody in the American Navy knows about: a nuclear torpedo. To fire it, all 3 officers have to agree. 2 of them already have. The third man does not. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. Almost no one has heard of him. But that day, one decision from a man nobody knew may have been the single most important decision of the entire 20th century. This is the story of the 72 hours the world came closest to ending, told hour by hour, through the eyes of the people who lived it.
To understand how we got to that submarine, we have to go back 8 days. It's October 1962. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union has been going on for almost 17 years. Both countries have nuclear weapons. Both are terrified of the other using them first. But there's a problem for the Soviet Union. Their nuclear missiles are far away, mostly inside their own country. If they ever needed to strike the United States, the missiles would take almost 30 minutes to arrive. That gives America time to see them coming and time to strike back. So the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, comes up with a plan. 90 miles off the coast of Florida, there's a small island, Cuba. A few years earlier, Cuba had a revolution, and its new leader, Fidel Castro, became a Soviet ally. Khrushchev makes Castro an offer. If Cuba lets the Soviet Union build missile bases on its land, the Soviets will defend Cuba from any future American invasion. Castro agrees. And just like that, the Soviet Union has a way to put nuclear missiles close enough to hit almost any city in the United States in under 10 minutes. For weeks, Soviet ships quietly deliver missile parts to Cuba, hidden under canvas and false cargo labels. American intelligence suspects something is happening, but they don't have proof. Then, on October 14, 1962, an American spy plane, a U-2, flying so high that most anti-aircraft weapons can't reach it, takes a series of photographs over Cuba. 2 days later, analysts finish studying the film. What they see stops the room cold. Rows of Soviet missile launchers under construction, aimed north, toward the United States. The photos land on President John F. Kennedy's desk on the morning of October 16th. He has just found out that nuclear weapons capable of destroying American cities are being built 90 miles from Florida. And he has no idea yet that the next 7 days will bring the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been before, or has been since. Kennedy calls together a small group of his most trusted advisors. They'll meet in secret, sometimes for 18 hours a day, making decisions that could kill millions of people either way. Some of his generals want to bomb the missile sites immediately. His own brother tells him to wait. And 3,000 miles away, a Soviet leader is about to make a decision of his own, one that will put the fate of the world in the hands of a submarine crew that nobody in Washington even knows exists.
Quick recap. It's October 1962. The Soviet Union has been secretly building nuclear missile bases in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. American spy planes just found proof. President Kennedy now has to decide what to do. He has, by his own advisor's estimate, maybe a week before those missiles are fully operational. On October 16th, Kennedy pulls together a small group of advisors. Historians would later call this group EXCOM, short for the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. It includes his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. It includes generals from the Pentagon. It includes diplomats, spies, and a handful of people Kennedy trusts more than anyone else in Washington. For the next 13 days, this small room becomes the most important room in the world, and almost none of it happens on camera. What we know about what was said inside comes from something remarkable. Kennedy secretly recorded many of these meetings on a hidden taping system. Decades later, those tapes were declassified. We can actually hear the fear, the disagreement, and the exhaustion in these men's voices. From the very first meeting, the room splits into two camps. One camp, mostly the military leaders, wants immediate action. Bomb the missile sites now, before they're finished. Some even push for a full invasion of Cuba.
The Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, is the loudest voice for attacking immediately. He warns that waiting will only make the missiles more dangerous, and that failing to act could be seen as weakness that invites the Soviets to push even further. The other camp is smaller and quieter, but it includes people close to Kennedy, like his brother Robert. Their argument: a surprise attack could kill Soviet soldiers stationed in Cuba, which might force the Soviet Union to strike back somewhere else in the world, maybe West Berlin, a city surrounded by Soviet territory and almost impossible to defend. In other words, bombing Cuba might not end the crisis. It might just move it somewhere else and make it worse. Kennedy listens to both sides for days. He doesn't rush. He knows that whatever he decides, people will die. The only question is, how many and where? On the evening of October 22nd, 1962, something happens that has never happened before in American history. Every single television and radio network in the country breaks into their normal programming at the same time for the same announcement. President Kennedy sits down in front of a camera in the Oval Office. Nobody watching at home knows what he's about to say. Many assume it's about the economy or maybe a labor strike. Instead, Kennedy tells the American public, and at the same moment the entire world, that the Soviet Union has been secretly building nuclear missile bases in Cuba. He explains, calmly but firmly, that the United States will not allow this to continue. He announces what he calls a quarantine. American ships will surround Cuba and stop any Soviet vessel suspected of carrying more weapons. Here's why that word, quarantine, matters, and why Kennedy's team spent hours arguing over it. Under international law, a naval blockade, physically stopping other countries' ships, is considered an act of war. Kennedy's lawyers were worried that calling it a blockade might justify the Soviet Union treating it as an attack.
So they invented a new word instead, quarantine. It described the exact same action, but it was a word with no official legal definition, which meant no one could point to international law and say America had just started a war. It's a small detail, but it shows just how carefully every single word in this crisis was being chosen. One wrong phrase in a speech watched by the entire planet could have been read as a declaration of war. Kennedy ends his speech with this warning: any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any country in the Western Hemisphere will be treated as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States and will be met with a full retaliatory response. In plain language, if even one missile fires from Cuba, Kennedy is promising all-out nuclear war in return. He has just told 80 million television viewers and the entire Soviet government that a hair trigger now exists, and nobody, not Kennedy, not Khrushchev, not a single general in either country, actually knows for certain what will happen if a single mistake gets made along the way. Within hours, more than 20 Soviet cargo ships are steaming toward the quarantine line, the invisible boundary in the ocean where U.S. Navy ships are waiting. Nobody knows what these ships are carrying. Nobody knows if their captains have been ordered to stop or to push through. American destroyers are given orders: intercept these ships, but do not fire first. If a ship refuses to stop, try to disable it without sinking it. Avoid killing anyone, if at all possible. For a day and a half, the world watches, through newspaper reports and radio bulletins, as the ships get closer and closer to the line. Inside the White House, someone hands Kennedy a report. 2 Soviet ships, the Gagarin and the Komolus, are just minutes away from reaching the quarantine line.
Secretary of State Dean Rusk turns to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and says something that gets written down in the meeting notes and later becomes one of the most quoted lines of the entire crisis. "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." The Soviet ships slow down. Some turned around completely. It looks for a moment like the most dangerous part of the crisis might be over. It wasn't.
Because while the world was watching the ships on the surface of the ocean, nobody was watching what was happening underneath it. 4 Soviet submarines had been shadowing those cargo ships the entire time. The U.S. Navy knew they were out there somewhere. What the U.S. Navy did not know, because Soviet military secrecy was that effective, was what those submarines were carrying. Each one was armed with a nuclear torpedo. And one of those 4 submarines was about to run out of air. That's where we're headed next. The moment the crisis stops being about ships and speeches and becomes about 3 exhausted men locked in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean, arguing over whether the war has already.
Quick recap. The Soviet Union has missiles in Cuba. Kennedy has announced a naval quarantine. For a day, it looked like the crisis might be cooling down. It wasn't. Because 4 Soviet submarines, each one carrying a nuclear torpedo, were still out there in the Atlantic. And nobody, not Kennedy, not Khrushchev, knew what was about to happen to one of them. October 27, 1962. Historians would later give this day a name, Black Saturday. It's widely considered the single most dangerous day in recorded human history. It starts before sunrise, with bad news arriving from 3 different directions, almost at once. First, overnight, someone in the Soviet Union had sent Kennedy a long, emotional, personal letter from Khrushchev, one that sounded like it was written by a man who was scared and wanted a way out. It hinted at a deal. But before Kennedy's team can even finish responding to it, a second, much harsher message arrives. This one more formal, more demanding, adding a new condition that hadn't been there before. The US must also remove its own missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's advisors are confused. Which message is the real Soviet position? Are there 2 different factions in the Kremlin fighting for control? Nobody in Washington knows. And in a crisis like this, not knowing who you're actually negotiating with is almost as dangerous as the weapons themselves. Then, the third piece of news arrives, and this one changes everything.
An American U-2 spy plane, flying its regular reconnaissance route over Cuba, is shot down by a Soviet-made surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., is killed. He becomes the only combat casualty of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a genuine crisis inside the crisis. Kennedy had specifically ordered that no U.S. plane should be shot down without his own military responding. Now one has been, and by the rules his own generals had asked him to agree to days earlier, this is supposed to trigger an automatic retaliatory airstrike. Kennedy pauses. He overrides the plan. He decides, against the direct advice of several of his top military commanders, not to retaliate immediately. He wants more information first. Was this an order from Moscow, or did a local Soviet commander in Cuba act on his own? It turns out to be the second option. A Soviet general on the ground in Cuba authorized the shootdown without asking Khrushchev, which means the crisis had just come frighteningly close to spiraling out of the control of either government entirely. Robert Kennedy would later write about this moment. He said it felt like the world was on the brink of a Holocaust, and that for the first time he saw genuine fear on the faces of men who were usually calm under pressure. And this, all of this, is happening on the surface, in Washington, in Moscow, in the news. Nobody in either capital knows that at the exact same time, the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War is unfolding somewhere they can't see it at all, 300 feet under the ocean.
To tell this next part properly, we need to go back a few days and follow a completely different group of people, men whose names would stay secret for the next 40 years. 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines had been sent from a Soviet naval base toward Cuba days before Kennedy even gave his televised speech. One of them was called B-59. These submarines were built for cold northern seas. Nobody had designed them to survive in the warm waters of the Caribbean. Their cooling systems weren't built for this climate. This detail, an engineering oversight, is about to matter enormously. On board B-59 were roughly 78 crew members and 3 senior officers who together held the fate of the mission. Captain Valentin Savitsky, the commanding officer of the submarine. Political officer Ivan Semenov, responsible for political discipline and morale, a standard role on all Soviet military vessels of this era. And Vasili Arkhipov, technically the second in command of the submarine, but also the chief of staff for the entire 4-submarine flotilla, meaning his rank actually gave him authority equal to or greater than the captain's. And in the submarine's torpedo room, 1 nuclear torpedo, roughly the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. For over a week, B-59 has been submerged, hiding from American ships trying to locate it. That means no radio contact with Moscow, no updates on the crisis, no idea what Kennedy has said on television, what ships are doing on the surface, or whether the 2 superpowers are already at war.
Inside the submarine, conditions have become almost unbearable. The air conditioning system, built for Arctic waters, cannot handle Caribbean heat. Temperatures inside some compartments climb past 45 degrees Celsius, and in the engine room, even higher. Carbon dioxide levels are rising because the submarine has had to stay underwater far longer than planned, unable to surface to refresh its air supply. Several crew members have already fainted from heat exhaustion. Drinking water is being rationed. Then, on the surface above them, an American aircraft carrier group finds B-59 with sonar. The American captain in charge has orders to force the Soviet submarine to surface, not to attack it, but to identify it and make it leave the area peacefully. The method they choose, dropping small practice depth charges, explosives about the size of a hand grenade, deliberately weak, designed only to signal, "We see you, please come up," not to cause real damage. But nobody told the Americans dropping those charges what conditions were like inside that submarine, and nobody inside the submarine had any way of knowing these were harmless signal charges. From inside B-59, it doesn't feel like a signal, it feels like an attack. The submarine shakes with each explosion, the lights flicker. Crew members who have not slept properly in days, who are dehydrated, overheated, and terrified, begin to believe the unthinkable, that the war everyone feared has already started, somewhere above them, and they are already under attack. Captain Savitsky has no way to check. He can't radio Moscow. He can't surface to look around without exposing his position. All he has is the sound of explosions around his ship, and days of isolation feeding his worst fears. According to surviving crew members interviewed decades later, Savitsky begins shouting that they are going to fight back. His exact words, as later recorded by a fellow officer and confirmed by historian Michael Dobbs's research, he says something to the effect of, "We're going to blow them up, and if we go down, we're going down together. We won't disgrace our Navy."
This is the moment. This is the single most dangerous few minutes of the Cold War. Arguably, of the entire nuclear age. Standard Soviet procedure requires all 3 senior officers to agree before the nuclear torpedo can be launched. Captain Savitsky votes yes. Political officer Semenov votes yes. Both men are exhausted, frightened, and convinced they are already at war. Both men believe firing the torpedo is not reckless, it is simply what soldiers do when the fighting has already begun. The decision now depends entirely on the third man, Vasili Arkhipov. We don't know every word said in that room. Nobody recorded it. But from the accounts of surviving crew members, we know the outline of what happened. Arkhipov does not accept that the war has started. He argues that the explosions they're feeling are too weak, too regular, too controlled to be a real attack. They feel more like a signal than a bombardment. He pushes back against the fear and the assumption that has taken hold of the room. He insists they cannot fire with more certainty. He argues that the submarine should surface and try to make contact instead of assuming the worst and launching an irreversible weapon.
It's worth pausing on how ordinary and how extraordinary this moment really is. There were no external safeguards stopping that torpedo. No president, no general staff, no fail-safe system built into the weapon itself. The only thing standing between that submarine and a nuclear detonation was one man, in a room full of exhausted, frightened people who outranked or matched him, choosing to argue for patience instead of panic. Eventually, Savitsky bats down. The submarine does not fire. Instead, B-59 surfaces right in front of the American ships that had been hunting it. The Americans who took that photograph had no idea what they were looking at. To them, it was just another Soviet submarine caught and forced to the surface, a small tactical win in a long standoff. They didn't know how close they had just come to being at the center of a nuclear explosion. They wouldn't find out for almost 40 years.
Above the water, in Washington and Moscow, the crisis is still boiling. A pilot has just died. A Soviet general disobeyed orders. Kennedy's own military is pushing him toward war. But the single closest moment the world came to nuclear catastrophe had already happened, quietly, secretly, 300 feet below the surface, and almost ended in a way that would have made everything happening above the water completely irrelevant. In the next part, we go back to the surface to find out how in the final 36 hours, two exhausted governments managed to step back from the edge, and what it cost both leaders to do it. Quick recap. It's Black Saturday, October 27, 1962. An American pilot has just been killed. A Soviet submarine, hidden under the ocean, came within minutes of firing a nuclear torpedo before one officer talked the crew down. On the surface, nobody in Washington or Moscow knows how close that came to happening. And the clock is still running. Kennedy's generals are telling him the missiles in Cuba could be fully operational within days, maybe hours. Let's go back to those two letters from Khrushchev. The confusing, contradictory messages that arrived within hours of each other on Black Saturday. The first one, sent late at night, reads almost like a personal, emotional plea. Khrushchev describes the danger the world is in and hints that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States promises never to invade the island. The second one, sent the next morning through official Soviet state radio, is colder and more demanding. It adds a new condition. The US must also remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, missiles pointed at the Soviet Union from a NATO country right on its border.
Kennedy's advisors are split on how to read this. Some think the harsher second letter represents hardliners in the Kremlin gaining control over Khrushchev. Others think Khrushchev wrote the soft one himself, in a moment of real fear, before his own government pressured him into toughening his position. Nobody in the White House can be completely sure which version of the Soviet government they're actually negotiating with, and they don't have time to figure it out through normal diplomatic channels. Normal channels take days. They have, by their own estimate, maybe hours. So Kennedy's team makes an unusual decision. Rather than respond to the confusing second letter, they simply pretend it never arrived. Instead, they write a reply to the first, softer letter, the one they can actually work with, and ignore the tougher demands entirely. This tactic later becomes known to historians as the trollop ploy, named after a plot device in Victorian romance novels, where a woman interprets an ordinary gesture as a marriage proposal, because that's the answer she needs it to be. Kennedy's team does something similar. They choose to hear the offer they can accept, and act as if that's the only one that was made. But there's still the problem of the Turkey missiles. Publicly agreeing to remove them would look to the rest of NATO and the world like the United States caving to Soviet pressure. It could shake the confidence of America's allies in Europe. So Kennedy authorizes something extremely risky, a secret, off-the-record back channel.
That evening, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, meets privately with the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, at the Justice Department. No press, no official record at the time. Just two men in a room, trying to end a crisis that public diplomacy hadn't been able to solve fast enough. Robert Kennedy delivers a message with real weight behind it. The United States is willing to promise never to invade Cuba if the Soviet missiles are removed, verified by international inspectors. As for the Turkish missiles, the US can agree to remove those too, but only quietly, later, and never as part of any public deal. If the Soviet Union tries to make that condition public or use it as leverage, the entire agreement falls apart. Robert Kennedy adds one more thing, according to later accounts of the meeting. Time is almost gone. His brother is under enormous pressure from his own military to act. If Moscow doesn't respond soon, events may spiral out of anyone's control on either side. This meeting is a gamble in every sense. If word leaked that the US was secretly negotiating to remove missiles from a NATO ally's territory, it could fracture the alliance. If the Soviets refused this offer and made further demands instead, there might be no time left for another round of secret diplomacy. Dobrynin relays the message to Moscow immediately, using the fastest secure channel available.
In Moscow, Khrushchev is facing his own version of the pressure Kennedy is under. His military advisors are divided. Some believe the Soviet Union should hold firm. Others believe the risk of a full nuclear exchange, one that would devastate the Soviet Union just as much as the United States, is no longer worth whatever political point they're trying to make. Khrushchev makes his decision quickly, and rather than send it through slow, formal diplomatic channels, where a delay of even a few hours could be catastrophic, he chooses to announce it the fastest way possible, over public radio. On the morning of October 28, 1962, Radio Moscow broadcasts a message from Khrushchev agreeing to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the American promise not to invade the island. It's an unusual way to end a crisis of this size, a public radio broadcast rather than a signed treaty or a formal diplomatic handshake, but it works, because both sides need it to be over quickly, and a public statement, heard by the whole world at once, is harder to walk back than a private cable that only a handful of officials ever see. Kennedy responds within hours, publicly welcoming Khrushchev's statesman-like decision and formally confirming the American promise not to invade Cuba. The secret part of the deal, quietly removing American missiles from Turkey, is not mentioned publicly by either side. It happens months later, handled carefully so it doesn't look connected to the Cuban crisis at all. In fact, it stays a closely guarded secret for over 25 years. Most people involved in the crisis, even some of Kennedy's own advisors, don't find out about that part of the deal until long after both Kennedy and Khrushchev are gone. 13 days after it began, and roughly 72 hours after the most dangerous stretch of it, the Cuban Missile Crisis is over. No missile was ever launched. No nuclear weapon was ever detonated in anger. The only combat death of the entire crisis was Major Rudolf Anderson, the U-2 pilot shot down over Cuba 2 days earlier. By almost any measure, this is one of the greatest acts of successful crisis management in modern history.
But statistics and treaties don't capture what actually almost happened. Two governments, run by exhausted, frightened, and imperfect human beings, spent 3 days making decisions that could have ended human civilization as we knew it. And it worked out, but not because the system was foolproof. It worked out because, again and again, individual people chose caution over panic, patience over pride, and quiet diplomacy over public victory. And one of the most important of those people wouldn't be recognized for it for almost 40 years. In our final part, we follow what happened to the key people in this story after the camera stopped rolling, including the submarine officer whose name the world almost never learned, and why his story matters just as much today as it did in 1962.
Quick recap. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended after 13 days, and after the most dangerous 72 hours of the entire Cold War. No missiles were fired. No nuclear weapon was used. The world stepped back from the edge. But what happened to the people who were actually standing at that edge? That's what this final part is about. Let's start with the two men whose names everyone already knows.
President John F. Kennedy is widely praised, both at the time and by historians ever since, for his handling of the crisis, for resisting pressure from his own generals to strike first, and for choosing patience over escalation, again and again, when the easier political choice would have been to look tough. But just over a year later, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He never gets the chance to reflect publicly in his later years on what those 72 hours meant to him, or what he learned from standing that close to a war that could have ended human civilization. Nikita Khrushchev survives the crisis politically, for a while, but the humiliation of appearing to back down to the United States, combined with a string of other domestic problems, weakens his position at home. In October 1964, almost exactly 2 years after the crisis, Khrushchev is removed from power by his own Communist Party colleagues in a quiet internal coup. He spends the rest of his life largely out of public view, writing memoirs that are smuggled out of the Soviet Union and published abroad, since his own government refuses to release them at home.
Both leaders, in different ways, pay a price for a decision that most historians now agree was the right one. And now, the man this entire story has been building toward. Vasili Arkhipov returns to the Soviet Union after the crisis, but he isn't welcomed home as a hero. Remember, from the perspective of Soviet Naval Command, submarine B-59 had failed its mission. It had been detected, forced to surface, and humiliated in front of American ships and aircraft. Arkhipov's superiors are far more interested in why the submarine got caught than in the fact that its senior officers had come within minutes of launching a nuclear weapon. According to accounts from those who knew him, Arkhipov faces criticism, not celebration, for what happened on B-59. The nuclear near launch is treated as a secret to be buried, not a decision to be honored, because openly discussing it would mean admitting that a Soviet officer very nearly started a nuclear war by mistake, based on a misunderstanding of harmless signal charges. Arkhipov continues his naval career quietly. He's eventually promoted to the rank of vice admiral, and later teaches at a Soviet Naval Academy. He retires in the 1980s. He dies in 1998, at the age of 72, from complications related to radiation exposure suffered years earlier during an unrelated 1961 incident involving a different submarine's reactor.
At the time of his death, almost nobody outside a small circle of Soviet naval historians knows what he did on October 27, 1962. His own family, by most accounts, understood only fragments of the story. The details of what happened aboard B-59 remained classified for decades after the crisis itself became public history. It isn't until the year 2002, 40 years after the crisis and 4 years after Arkhipov's death, that the full details of what happened on B-59 are finally declassified and confirmed through American and Russian historical research, much of it compiled by the National Security Archive in Washington and historian Michael Dobbs. When the story finally becomes widely known, historians and journalists react with something close to disbelief. Thomas Blanton, who at the time directed the National Security Archive, put it simply: a single Soviet officer, whose name almost nobody had ever heard, may have single-handedly prevented a nuclear war. Arkhipov never gave interviews about it. He never wrote a memoir. He never seems to have described himself, even privately, as someone who saved the world. By every account we have of him, he simply believed he had done his job, stayed calm, asked for more information before acting, and refused to treat an assumption as a certainty when the stakes were this high.
So, why does a decision made by one exhausted naval officer inside a boiling hot submarine 60 years ago still matters today? Because the systems that are supposed to prevent nuclear war, the treaties, the hotlines, the chains of command, are built and operated by human beings. And human beings, under enough stress
exhaustion, and fear, make mistakes. They misread signals. They assume the worst. They act on incomplete information because incomplete information is often all there is. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't come close to nuclear war because any single government wanted one. It came close because a series of ordinary human errors, misunderstandings, and coincidences. A spy plane shot down without authorization, harmless step charges mistaken for an attack, two contradictory letters arriving hours apart, nearly added up to catastrophe almost entirely by accident. And it didn't happen, not because of superior technology, not because of some fail-safe system built into the weapons themselves, but because, at several critical moments, individual people chose to pause, question their assumptions, and resist the pressure to act immediately. Kennedy did it in the Oval Office, resisting his own generals. Arkhipov did it 300 feet under the ocean, resisting his own captain. Neither one of them could see what the other was doing. Neither one of them knew at the time how much the other's restraint mattered. But together, in totally separate rooms, thousands of miles apart, they made the same choice: doubt the certainty of disaster, just long enough to look for another way. Today, that photograph exists in the American Military Archive as a simple record of a submarine caught during a Cold War standoff. Most people who see it will never know what very nearly happened just moments before it was taken. But now, you do.
Final line. Deliver simply. No music swell drowning out the words. Let a few seconds of near silence follow before the fade to black. History remembers the leaders who avoided the war,